Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If these reflections speak to something silent inside you, subscribe so you don't lose the path back here. Every like, every comment helps this message find those who are still searching in the dark. Now, let's begin. Carl Jung's most unsettling realization was not about pathology or illness. It was about the rare individuals who see what others cannot, and the quiet devastation this ability brings long before it becomes a source of strength. Some people do not look at the world, they penetrate it. They walk into a room and feel its emotional temperature before anyone speaks. They sense the fracture behind a smile, the resentment buried beneath politeness, the grief hiding behind practiced composure. They detect lies not because they are suspicious, but because their psyche hears what the voice tries to conceal. Jung called this differentiated perceptions, and he warned, "It is not a gift for the faint-hearted." For those born with this level of intuitive clarity, the world becomes a place of unfiltered signals, a flood of unconscious information streaming toward them at all times. They don't merely observe people, they decode them. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Seeing too much comes with a psychological cost so profound that most people will never understand it. These perceptive individuals often grow up feeling isolated without knowing why. It isn't social anxiety. It isn't introversion. It is the silent realization that they are living in a different psychological reality than everyone else. A reality where nothing is ever just a joke, where tension is felt before it is spoken, where truth cuts through surface-level narratives with surgical precision. In 1913, Jung documented a patient whose abilities were so unusual that she became the cornerstone of his research. She was the rarest type, an introverted intuitive whose perception operated beyond the conscious thresholds of those around her. She struggled to participate in simple conversations because she could see straight through the masks. Friendships dissolved because people felt exposed in her presence. Workplaces collapsed around her because her clarity disrupted the unspoken agreements that keep groups functioning. Jung realized he wasn't treating an illness. He was witnessing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious. He wrote, "She perceives the unspoken contents of others with remarkable accuracy, and this faculty distresses her far more than it benefits her." This was not delusion. This was consciousness evolving faster than its environment. But here is the danger Jung identified. When someone sees what others cannot bear to see, the world turns against the mirror, not the truth. Highly perceptive individuals become targets for shadow projection. People unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Someone feels exposed, so they accuse the intuitive person of being too sensitive. Someone feels threatened, so they call them judgmental. Someone feels seen too clearly, so they label them negative, dramatic, or overthinking. The pattern is ancient. When the mirror reflects the shadow, the unconscious prefers to shatter the mirror rather than face its own image. Jung called this the scapegoat phenomenon, and it explains why perceptive individuals so often become the emotional lightning rods of their families, groups, and relationships. Not because they cause disturbance, but because they illuminate it. But Jung did not stop there. He realized something far more revolutionary. The very ability that isolates these individuals is the same ability that, if integrated, can transform them into psychological pioneers. Seeing deeply is not the problem, suffering because of it is. The world isn't ready for their level of consciousness, but consciousness evolves because of people exactly like them. And so begins the real journey. Learning not to shut down the gift, not to drown in it, but to wield it with clarity, sovereignty, and intentional wisdom. Jung eventually realized there was a pattern hidden beneath every perceptive individual's suffering, a pattern so consistent that he began to call it the invisible cost of seeing too clearly. Because here's the truth Jung uncovered. You do not pay for this gift with effort. You pay for it with isolation. From childhood, these individuals begin noticing what others pretend not to see. The forced smile that doesn't match the eyes, the anger vibrating beneath a soft tone, the jealousy disguised as a compliment, the unspoken tension sitting like fog in a family kitchen. Most children overlook these things, but not the intuitive one. Their mind records everything, every contradiction, every micro-expression, every inconsistency in someone's emotional state. They become attuned to the unconscious music of the people around them. And that's where the danger begins. Because most families, most groups, most societies depend on shared illusions to function. Unspoken agreements. We don't talk about that. Everything is fine. Pretend you didn't notice. Keep the peace. But Jung's rare intuitive type disrupts these illusions simply by existing. Their clarity destabilizes the collective unconscious, the way a candle exposes the darkness in a room. They become the one who feels the argument before it happens, senses betrayal before proof appears, recognizes manipulation while others still call it kindness. And because they're young, they don't yet know that people fear what they cannot hide from. So the child learns, painfully, that speaking truth leads to punishment. They are told, "You're imagining things. You're too sensitive. Stop being dramatic." That's not what's happening. Jung identified this as gaslighting by the unconscious, not always intentional but always destructive. The message becomes internalized. My perception is wrong. My feelings are wrong. My truth is too much. And so the intuitive one learns to silence the gift in order to belong. They stop voicing what they see. They stop trusting their inner alarm system. They stop pointing out dysfunction that everyone else is desperate to ignore. But the gift doesn't disappear, it simply goes inward. It becomes private, silent, overwhelming. And here is the tragedy Jung highlighted. When you see everything but express nothing, your mind becomes a container for truths that no one else is willing to hold. By adolescence, these individuals are already exhausted, not from living, so from perceiving. Their nervous system is activated by tensions no one else acknowledges. Their empathy is overloaded with emotions no one else will claim. Their intuition is burdened with patterns no one else wants to see. Jung wrote, "The one who sees becomes the one who carries." Not by choice, but by psychological inevitability. This is why highly perceptive individuals often feel older than their age, more tired than they should be, more alone than anyone realizes. They are not fragile, they are overexposed. They're living in a reality that others avoid, a more honest, more complex, more conscious world. A world where nothing stays hidden. A world most people are not ready to inhabit. And so the perceptive one becomes the outsider, the quiet observer, the person who stands slightly apart. Not because they don't belong, but because belonging requires blindness. And blindness is something they can't force. But Jung also knew something else, something almost no one talks about. This isolation is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of transformation. Because once the perceptive individual learns how to integrate what they see instead of drowning in it, everything begins to change. Jung noticed that the suffering of the highly perceptive was never caused by the seeing itself, but by the lack of an inner structure strong enough to hold what they saw. When perception runs ahead of identity, awareness becomes a burden. This is why Jung described these individuals as carriers of unconscious contents, people who sensed dynamics long before anyone else had language for them. But here's the critical paradox Jung discovered. Your mind evolved to see the invisible, but you were never taught how to live with what you see. You can read someone's intention before they speak a word. You feel when energy shifts. You notice the fracture in a smile that others interpret as friendliness. You know the relationship is dying long before the breakup, You sense the betrayal before the confession. You feel the hostility before the argument. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. This is unconscious data analysis. This is differentiated perception, a psychological superpower that arrives decades too early. A child cannot handle it. An adolescent misinterprets it. An adult suppresses it. But the perception never stops. And so Jung's intuitive patients entered adulthood with two competing realities. Reality 1, they saw too much. Reality 2, they were taught to trust themselves too little. This creates the internal split Jung observed again and again. One part of you sees the truth. Another part of you denies it to survive. This split is the reason perceptive individuals feel emotionally exhausted, spiritually displaced, socially alien, mentally overstimulated, responsible for everyone's unspoken feelings. They don't just sense what others feel, they absorb it. They don't just notice dysfunction, they anticipate it. They don't just feel tension, they hold it until the entire system collapses. And Jung realized something devastating. People don't hate the perceptive one because they're wrong. They hate them because they're right too early. Your clarity threatens unconscious agreements. Your presence disrupts collective denial. Your intuition exposes the shadows people would rather project than integrate. So instead of being valued, you become the target. Jung saw this in every intuitive patient. They weren't invited into groups, they were tolerated. They weren't appreciated for their insight. They were avoided for it. They weren't rejected because they were flawed. They were rejected because they saw flaws too clearly. Jung wrote, "The one who sees becomes the one who triggers the unconscious in others. Not because you confront people, but because your very presence confronts them. You become the psychological mirror that forces truth into awareness. And most people don't want a mirror. They want a mask. This is why you were called too much. Overly sensitive, intense, dramatic, paranoid, overthinking. None of these were diagnoses. They were defensive reactions from people who couldn't handle being seen. But Jung understood something they didn't. Your perception is not the problem. Your lack of integration is. Because once you learn how to filter what you absorb, identify what belongs to you versus others, hold perception without drowning in it, see without carrying, feel without merging, your gift stops destroying you and starts transforming you. You cease being the mirror people fear and become the guide they never knew they needed. Jung believed this moment, the moment perception becomes integrated, is the beginning of individuation. The moment you stop being overwhelmed by what you see and start understanding why you see it. And that moment changes everything. Jung's next realization was even more unsettling. Not all perceptive individuals perceive in the same way. And because their perception differs, so does the way they suffer. In his private notes and later writings, Jung identified 4 distinct expressions of differentiated perception, each one powerful, each one dangerous without integration, and each one misunderstood by the world. Let's step into these archetypes, not as labels, but as psychological mirrors that help you recognize why you experience the world so differently. Type 1, the feeling intuitive. The empath whose heart becomes an antenna. These are the individuals Jung said, feel the unlived emotions of others as if they were their own. They don't just read emotions, they absorb them. Enter a room with tension. Their body collapses. Someone suppresses anger. They feel it as chest pressure. A friend hides grief. They carry the grief for them. Jung noticed these individuals often grew up in volatile homes, where emotional safety depended on sensing danger early. Their gift became their shield. Their curse became their identity. The danger? They lose the ability to distinguish between their own emotional life and the emotional debris of everyone around them. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in emotional contagion. Without boundaries, they drown in other people's storms long before they ever experience their own rain. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. The strategist who sees consequences before they exist. These individuals don't feel the room, they decode it. They see patterns in behavior months before others notice a single crack. Jung was stunned by their accuracy, predicting breakups, anticipating betrayals, sensing professional collapse, seeing where someone's unconscious choices would lead. Not through logic, not through suspicion, but through unconscious pattern recognition so advanced it borders on precognition. The danger: isolation. People fear those who understand them too well, especially when that understanding is unspoken. Jung wrote, "The thinking intuitive perceives the logical conclusion of unconscious processes others have not yet begun to suspect. This makes them prophetic and profoundly alone." Type 3. The sensation intuitive. The body reader. These people sense psychological truth in the physical world. They detect illness before symptoms. They feel tension as pain. They identify emotional collapse from the way someone breathes. Their bodies become instruments of perception. The danger? Their nervous system becomes overloaded, because everything the world refuses to feel lands in their physiology. Jung wrote, "They serve as early warning systems for the emotional and physical states of others. This is a gift and an unbearable weight when untrained." Type 4. The pure intuitive. The one who sees everything and understands nothing yet. These are the rarest. The ones Jung called undifferentiated intuitive perceivers. They see symbols, archetypes, unconscious motives, future possibilities, hidden dynamics, all at once. But they lack a container. Their perception floods them, leaving them overwhelmed, unable to articulate what they know, and often mistreated or misunderstood as unstable. Jung said, "They live in perpetual overwhelm because they receive more than they can structure." These individuals either collapse or become mystics, innovators, or visionaries once they integrate their inner architecture. The universal threat: shadow projection. Regardless of type, Jung discovered the same force hunted every highly perceptive person. Shadow projection. When you see people clearly, you unknowingly expose what they cannot face. Their unconscious reacts automatically, not by integrating, but by attacking the mirror. You become too intense, too sensitive, paranoid, dramatic, judgmental. The problem. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, "One becomes the repository of all that others refuse to acknowledge within themselves." This is the crucifixion of the perceptive, not because they are wrong, but because they are right before others are ready. But Jung also discovered that what destroys the unintegrated intuitive becomes unshakable power once integrated. And that transition, from overwhelmed observer to conscious seer, is the beginning of everything. Jung realized that the danger wasn't in the gift itself, but in the lack of preparation for such a gift. When someone sees deeply without the psychological muscles to carry what they see, their perception becomes a blade that turns inward. And this is where Jung identified the three dangers that make differentiated perception so destructive before it becomes transformative. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption. To see clearly is to break the agreements that keep society functioning. Every group, families, workplaces, friendships operates on unspoken rules. What will be acknowledged? What will be ignored? What is safe to feel? What must remain hidden? When you perceive what everyone else is silently avoiding, you disrupt the equilibrium. Not by speaking, but simply by existing. Jung said, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreement society relies on. You become a disturbance because you represent what the group is trying not to see. People don't expel you because you're wrong. They expel you because you're accurate. Your clarity destabilizes the collective dream they're addicted to. Danger 2, psychological isolation. Consciousness becomes exile. The more you see, the less you can pretend. And pretending is what allows most people to stay connected. But the perceptive individual cannot lie to themselves, not convincingly, not for long. Jung wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. This creates a haunting loneliness. You're surrounded by people but disconnected from them psychologically. You speak truth, but others hear threat. You seek connection, but others withdraw from the intensity of being seen. You are not alone, you are simply ahead. But without integration, it feels like exile." Danger 3, identity dissolution. When you absorb too much of others, you disappear. This is the most devastating of Jung's warnings. Highly perceptive individuals don't just observe the unconscious, they absorb it. They become the emotional container, the shadow holder, the unspoken conscience of the group. And slowly, imperceptibly, their own identity dissolves. Jung called this participation mystique. The dissolution of psychological boundaries and the merging with unconscious contents of others. Without conscious discrimination, you cannot tell which emotions are yours, which fears are yours, which thoughts are yours. Your psyche becomes a marketplace of everyone else's unresolved inner worlds. This is why perceptive people collapse. Not because they are weak, but because they have carried too much that never belonged to them. The turning point. The danger becomes destiny, only when consciousness enters the equation. Jung believed that the people who see most are also the people the world needs most. But only if they learn the art of differentiation. He developed an entire system to help them survive their own depth, a system still unmatched today. Individuation. Not a self-improvement trend, not a spiritual practice, a psychological necessity. A path that turns the overwhelmed intuitive into the integrated seer. A path that transforms perception from curse to compass. A path that prevents collapse and initiates awakening. Jung understood that superior perception is not the problem. The problem is undifferentiated perception, perceiving everything without knowing what any of it means or where it belongs. So he built a path, a psychological scaffolding, a way to survive the very thing that would otherwise break you. He called it the individuation process, but for the highly perceptive, it functions more like a lifeline, a method for staying intact while swimming in other people's unconscious material. Below are the phases Jung walked his most perceptive patients through, not to dim their vision, but to make that vision usable, bearable, and powerful. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. You must know what belongs to you before you can carry what belongs to the world. The first step is the most disorienting. You learn that most of what you feel isn't yours. Jung taught perceptive individuals to ask, is this emotion mine? Is this fear mine? Is this anger mine? Or have I absorbed it from someone else? He wrote, without discrimination, there can be no individual development. This phase is painful because you discover that you've built your identity around borrowed psychological material. So Jung assigned a core practice, daily solitude, not as escapism, but as a way to let absorbed contents settle so your authentic inner voice can finally be heard. At first, the silence feels frightening, then it becomes clarifying, then it becomes sacred. Phase 2, shadow integration. The clearer you see others, the more essential it becomes to face what you avoid in yourself. People with differentiated perceptions see everyone else's shadows with ease. But Jung realized the danger. They often have no relationship with their own shadow. This makes them too responsible, too accommodating, and too morally rigid, too easily overwhelmed. Because every unintegrated shadow in others activates their unintegrated shadow in themselves. Jung taught, what we deny in ourselves we encounter endlessly in others. Shadow integration isn't becoming dark, it's becoming whole. It means admitting, I can be selfish, I can deceive, I can harm, I can choose myself. And paradoxically, the moment the intuitive person owns these truths, they stop being controlled by them. Only the integrated can see clearly without collapsing or judging. Phase 3, conscious participation. To engage without merging, to feel without drowning, to perceive without absorbing. This is where perception becomes mastery. Jung defined conscious participation as a relationship with unconscious contents without becoming possessed by them. The perceptive individual learns to read the emotional field without becoming the emotional field, see the psychological pattern without getting pulled into it, hold someone's shadow without losing themselves in the darkness. Jung gave them tools, the same tools he used during his own confrontation with the unconscious. Grounding through sensory awareness, symbolic interpretation rather than emotional fusion, witnessing instead of absorbing, naming without identifying. This phase creates a shocking change. You become able to walk into the same rooms that once overwhelmed you and remain untouched. Not because you feel less, but because you finally know what belongs to you and what does not. Phase 4, the emergence of the integrated seer. This is when the transformation becomes visible to others. People feel it immediately. Your presence becomes grounded rather than porous. Your perception becomes calm rather than chaotic. Your intuition becomes a tool rather than a burden. Your boundaries become energetic rather than spoken. Jung described this state beautifully. The individuated person becomes a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious world. You don't just see what others cannot. You know how to translate it, use it, protect yourself from it, and direct it toward healing instead of collapse. This is the moment your perception stops destroying you and starts elevating you. This is the birth of the intuitive sovereign. Jung realized that not all who see deeply see in the same way. Differentiated perception expresses itself through different psychological channels, and each carries its own dangers, its own gifts, and its own path to integration. He identified 4 intuitive subtypes, each representing a different way the unconscious flows into consciousness. Understanding your type is not a matter of personality preference, it's a matter of psychological survival. Because each path requires a different kind of integration. Type 1, the feeling intuitive. They do not see the pain, they become it. These individuals absorb emotions the way others absorb air. They feel grief that isn't theirs, anger they've never earned, anxiety that belongs to the room. Not metaphorically, literally. Jung wrote, the feeling intuitive lives in a state of emotional contagion. Their empathy is so advanced that they lose the ability to distinguish between internal and external emotion. This makes them extraordinary healers but dangerous to themselves. Without boundaries, their life becomes a reservoir of everyone else's unresolved emotional lives. Their integration path, emotional differentiation and nervous system grounding. Their danger, drowning in waves that were never theirs. Type 2, the thinking intuitive. They see the outcome before others see the beginning. These individuals perceive patterns with surgical clarity. They can sense relationships that will collapse, lies before they're spoken, the trajectory of a person's life months ahead, the psychological chain reaction hidden inside every choice. Jung observed, they perceive the logical conclusion of unconscious processes before consciousness has even noticed them. This makes them look prophetic or unsettling. Others sense this and often become defensive. Stop overanalyzing. Why do you assume the worst? You're reading too much into things. But they aren't. Their mind is simply one step ahead of the collective. Their integration path. Learning to communicate insights without overwhelming others. Their danger. Intellectual isolation and existential frustration. Type 3, the sensation intuitive. They feel the body speak. These individuals detect the physical expressions of the psyche. Illness before symptoms, fatigue before it's admitted, suppressed anger held in someone's posture, emotional tension carried in breath. Jung wrote, "They are early warning systems for both psychological and physical disease." People often accuse them, "You're imagining things. You're worrying too much. You're hypersensitive." But they're not wrong. They're registering signals others aren't equipped to notice. Their integration path, learning to separate physical intuition from personal anxiety. Their danger, somatizing others' psychological disorders. Type 4, the pure intuitive. The floodgate without a filter. The rarest and often the most overwhelmed. They see everything, patterns, emotions, motives, timelines, but struggle to articulate or organize what they perceive. Jung wrote, "They live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving more unconscious material than their structure can process." These are the people who say, "I don't know how I know, I just know. I can feel everything at once. It's like I'm watching 3 layers of reality." To others they seem gifted. To themselves they often feel broken. Their integration path, structure, grounding, symbolic language, and external containment. Their danger, identity fragmentation through overwhelm. The importance of recognizing your type. Jung emphasized, "A gift not understood becomes a burden. A gift understood becomes a destiny." Each intuitive type has its own shadow, its own vulnerability, its own transformative power. But they share one thing: superior perception that must be integrated, or else it will turn inward and consume them. When you understand your type, you unlock the method Jung designed to survive your own depth. You stop thinking you're too sensitive and too analytical, too intense and too overwhelmed. You finally understand. You are wired to perceive what the collective cannot yet bear to see. And that means your path will never look like theirs. Jung realized that extraordinary perception does not merely affect the individual. It destabilizes the entire psychological ecosystem around them. Because when one person sees too much, everyone connected to them must face what they have spent a lifetime avoiding. And this is where Jung's most disturbing insight appears. Superior perception is dangerous, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it threatens. He identified 3 psychological dangers that consistently destroyed or transformed people with highly differentiated perception. Danger 1, collective unconscious disruption. When one person sees clearly, the entire group becomes unstable. Families, workplaces, social circles all rely on shared illusions to function. Illusions like, "We are fine. No one is angry. That behavior isn't harmful. We don't talk about that. Everything is normal." These unspoken agreements create a psychological glue that holds groups together. But the highly perceptive individual breaks these agreements simply by existing. Jung wrote, "When one perceives what the group denies, the group reacts as though threatened with dissolution." This is why such individuals disrupt family dynamics, expose hidden tensions at work, provoke defensiveness in friends, are accused of creating problems. They aren't creating anything. They are simply refusing to participate in the unconscious contract of denial. Danger 2, psychological isolation. The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared. Jung observed that people with superior perception often report a haunting loneliness. "I see what others don't see." I feel like I live in another reality. No one understands the depth I'm picking up. I feel older than everyone else. This isolation isn't social, it's existential. Jung wrote, "The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. The deeper your perception, the fewer people you can truly connect with. Not because you are difficult, but because most people cannot tolerate being seen that clearly." Danger 3. Identity dissolution. When everything flows into you, you forget where you end and others begin. This was the most serious danger Jung identified. He observed that many highly perceptive individuals became so flooded with unconscious material that they lost touch with their own center. He named this state participation mystique, a merger with the collective unconscious. Signs include absorbing others' moods instantly, feeling emotions that aren't yours, losing your sense of direction, becoming whatever the environment needs, having no clear identity when alone. Jung wrote, "The danger is psychological annihilation, the loss of the individual to the collective." This is why these individuals often ask, "Who am I when no one needs me? Why do I feel empty when I'm alone? Why do I change depending on who I'm with?" Their boundaries were never built, because their perception developed too early and too intensely. The scapegoat phenomenon. The moment that destroys highly perceptive individuals before it transforms them. Jung documented this phenomenon repeatedly. The one who sees most becomes the one the group unconsciously sacrifices. Not metaphorically, psychologically. Whenever a family, workplace, or friend group needs someone to carry the shadow, the role almost always falls to the person with the deepest insight. Because they notice too much, they feel too much, they question too much, they refuse to participate in denial. Jung wrote, "The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot acknowledge." This is why such individuals are often blamed for tension they didn't create, accused of being negative, told they're too intense, pushed out when they speak truth, treated as the emotional dumping ground. The group is not attacking them. The group is attacking its own unexamined, unconscious content. They are the mirror, and humans destroy the mirror before facing their reflection. The turning point, from danger to transformation. Jung insisted that superior perception is not meant to be suppressed. It is meant to be integrated. But until integration happens, the gift behaves like a curse. Jung wrote, "The unconscious becomes dangerous when it is not brought into relationship with consciousness." In other words, your perception is dangerous only when you don't yet know how to wield it consciously. The moment you begin integration, solitude, shadow work, boundaries, disentangling your identity from absorbed material, everything changes. The gift stops destroying you and begins to transform you. The scapegoat becomes the guide. The burden becomes clarity. The curse becomes vision. And the individual society once rejected becomes exactly the type Jung believed was essential for humanity's evolution. Jung understood that not all forms of superior perception operate the same way. Two people may both see everything, yet experience completely different internal worlds. This is why he identified 4 intuitive subtypes, each with its own dangers, burdens, and path to integration. These types determine how you perceive, how you absorb, and how you break. Type 1, the feeling intuitive. I don't just see it, I feel it in my body. This was the most emotionally overwhelmed group Jung observed. They are emotional sponges, somatic intuitives, unconscious healers, containers for others' feelings. They experience anxiety that isn't theirs, sadness they absorbed from a room, mood shifts tied to someone else's inner world, exhaustion after being around people. Jung wrote, They live in a state of perpetual emotional contagion. Their greatest danger is identity erosion. They feel everything but cannot separate self from other. The integration path. 1. Daily solitude to allow emotional sediment to settle. 2. Body-based practices to separate felt from absorbed. 3. Conscious boundaries. Your emotions are valid, but they are not mine to carry. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. I see where this is going long before anyone else does. These individuals predict outcomes with uncanny accuracy, sense which relationships are dying, detect deception instantly, understand the deeper mechanics of behavior. Jung said they could perceive the logical conclusion of an unconscious process that the other person had not even begun to sense. Their danger is cognitive isolation. People think they're cold, arrogant, or too intense, but they simply see the inevitable sooner. The integration path. 1. Learning when to reveal insights and when to hold silence. 2. Replacing prediction with presence. 3. Finding others who value deep perception rather than fear it. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. I can feel what's wrong before anyone says a word. Jung documented these individuals as early warning systems. They sense physical illness before symptoms, stress before it's expressed, tension before it erupts, danger before it's visible. Their intuition is body first, thought second. Their danger is somatic overwhelm, taking on the physical manifestations of others' psychological states. The integration path. 1. Grounding techniques to discharge absorbed tension. 2. Breathwork for boundary control. 3. Ritualized self-checks. What in me is mine? What did I absorb? Type 4. The pure intuitive. I see too much and cannot organize any of it. This is the rarest and most tormented group. Jung described them as living in a state of perceptual flooding, constant insight, overwhelming symbolic impressions, psychic noise, difficulty translating perception into language. These are the mystics, the visionaries, the ones who seem ahead of their time but suffer profoundly. Their danger is psychological dissolution, being swallowed by the unconscious without a strong ego structure to anchor them. The integration path. 1. Structure, grounding, daily rhythm to counterbalance intuitive chaos. 2. Creative expression to translate perception into form. 3. A witness figure, therapist, mentor, to reality check and anchor them. The three-phase individuation protocol. Jung's method for saving people whose perception threatens to overwhelm them. Phase 1. Recognition and discrimination. You learn to identify what belongs to you, what you absorbed, what arises from shadow, what arises from others. This alone can stop years of psychological bleeding. Core question. Is this mine? Phase 2. Shadow integration. The more you see in others, the more urgently you must face in yourself. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Here you integrate your anger, your ego, your desire for control, your suppressed intelligence, your hidden superiority, your capacity for manipulation. Because if you don't integrate these qualities, you will project them onto those you perceive. Phase 3. Conscious participation. This is the final transformation. You learn to see deeply without absorbing, feel intensely without drowning, observe clearly without judging, reflect truth without attacking, guide others without imposing. This is the state Jung called the individuated intuitive, a consciousness capable of seeing the unconscious without becoming consumed by it. The turn from curse to capacity. When integration begins, Isolation becomes discernment. Overwhelm becomes precision. Emotional chaos becomes emotional intelligence. Hypervigilance becomes insight. Exhaustion becomes clarity. Difference becomes destiny. Jung wrote, "The task is not to see less, it is to see more wisely." Before integration, your perception destroys your life. After integration, your perception becomes your instrument for navigating the world with mastery and sovereignty. Jung realized that once a highly perceptive person becomes conscious of their abilities, a second transformation must occur, one far more challenging than the first. Because awakening to perception does not automatically grant you control over it. In fact, the opposite happens. The more you see, the more you risk drowning in what you see. Jung warned that without boundaries, superior perception becomes a psychic open wound, absorbing, reflecting, and reacting to everything in the environment. This is why the next stage of individuation requires learning a skill most intuitives have never been taught. Conscious boundaries. Not walls of fear, but deliberate gates of perception. Boundaries are not about keeping people out. They are about deciding what enters your consciousness and what does not. Jung taught that boundaries for highly perceptive individuals must be psychological, energetic, and symbolic. Let's break them down. Boundary type 1, cognitive boundaries. I choose what I interpret. Most perceptive people feel obligated to process everything they notice. Every tone shift, every micro-expression, every hidden motive. This is why they're exhausted. Jung taught that superior perception must be selective, not total. You learn to ask, does this require my attention? Is this my responsibility to interpret? Does engaging with this serve my individuation? Because high perception without selective engagement is not a gift. It is a psychic burden that will collapse you. Boundary type 2, emotional boundaries. I feel it, but I don't become it. Before integration, empaths and intuitives confuse awareness with absorption. They believe, if I sense your sadness, I must carry it. If I perceive your tension, I must fix it. If I detect your insecurity, I must soften myself. Jung called this participation mystique, the collapse of psychological distance between self and other. The shift happens when you internalize this truth. Feeling someone's emotion does not make it yours. The integrated intuitive can sense everything with precision, but absorb nothing unintentionally. Boundary type 3, symbolic boundaries. My inner world is not an open field. Jung believed symbolism is the language of the unconscious. Therefore, imagery, dreams, intuition, and psychic impressions must be given containers. Otherwise, they spill everywhere. For example, a journal becomes a container. A ritual becomes a container. Meditation becomes a container. Art becomes a container. Container equals psyche protection. When you don't create containers, your unconscious becomes a battleground for every emotion, trauma, and projection around you. When you do create them, your unconscious becomes a sanctuary, a place where perception is digested rather than suffered. Why people attack those who see clearly. This was one of Jung's most painful insights. He discovered that extremely perceptive individuals are attacked, not because they are wrong, but because they are right. People do not fear your sensitivity, they fear your accuracy. Jung documented this repeatedly. When you see the hidden tension, they accuse you of creating it. When you notice inconsistencies, they brand you suspicious. When you sense their shadow, they call you judgmental. When you reflect their unconscious patterns, and they call you dangerous. Why? Because seeing clearly forces others into a choice they do not want to make. Integrate their shadow or attack the mirror. Most choose to attack the mirror. But here is the lesson Jung considered sacred. Their reactions do not define you. They reveal them. The shift from target to mirror. Before integration, You become the group's scapegoat. After integration, you become the group's truth teller simply through your presence. You do not confront, you do not expose, you do not accuse. You simply exist with a level of awareness others are not yet ready to face. And that alone reorganizes the social field. This is why integrated intuitives appear powerful without effort. Their clarity burns away illusion just by being in the room. The point at which perception becomes power. Jung believed transformation happens when you stop being overwhelmed by insight and start directing insight. When the gift stops using you and you begin using the gift. This is the moment when intuition becomes strategy, sensitivity becomes discernment, perception becomes pattern recognition, overwhelm becomes sovereignty, isolation becomes initiation. Jung wrote, "The power is never in what you see. It is in what you do with what you see." Jung identified 3 dangers that make superior perception feel like both a gift and a threat. The first is collective unconscious disruption. Groups survive by maintaining shared illusions, unspoken agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. When someone sees through these illusions, their very presence destabilizes the system. Families feel exposed. Workplaces feel threatened. Friendships feel disrupted. Not because the perceptive individual is doing anything wrong, but because they see what everyone else is avoiding. The second danger is psychological isolation. Jung wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it." People who perceive deeply often report a strange loneliness, as if they are living in a different psychological dimension. They sense motives others don't sense, patterns others don't see, truths others aren't ready to face. This isolation becomes existential, not just social. The third danger is identity dissolution. When your perception absorbs unconscious material from others, your own boundaries begin to dissolve. You feel emotions that aren't yours. You carry burdens that never belonged to you. You become a psychological sponge, so flooded with external content that your own inner voice becomes faint. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where the boundary between self and other becomes blurred. Left unchecked, this leads to what he described as psychological annihilation, not a physical destruction, but the quiet erasure of your authentic identity. This is why Jung considered integration not optional, but urgent. Because without conscious individuation, superior perception becomes self-destructive. But with individuation, it becomes the beginning of extraordinary transformation. Jung taught that the first phase of integration is recognition and differentiation. The perceptive individual must learn to identify which emotions, thoughts, and impulses originate within themselves and which have been absorbed from others. Without this discrimination, there is no stable ground to stand on. You cannot build an identity while drowning in the psychological contents of everyone around you. Jung instructed his patients to seek intentional solitude, not as escape, but as calibration. Time alone allows the sediment of absorbed material to settle, revealing what truly belongs to you. Only in silence can you hear your authentic voice beneath the noise of others' unconscious projections. The second phase is shadow integration. Jung discovered that those who see others' shadows clearly often struggle to acknowledge their own. The more you deny your capacity for envy, manipulation, anger, or selfishness, the more disturbed you become when those traits appear in others. But once you integrate your own shadow, your perception becomes grounded instead of overwhelming. You no longer feel attacked by what you see, you understand it. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead to an understanding of ourselves." Shadow integration transforms perception from a weapon that wounds you into a tool that strengthens you. The third phase is conscious participation. This is the ability to engage with others' psychological material without losing your own identity in the process. You become a container, not a sponge. You can hold what others feel without absorbing it, witness without merging, see clearly without being destabilized. This is the beginning of psychological sovereignty. The moment perception becomes power instead of burden. Jung warned that superior perception becomes dangerous when it isolates the individual from the collective. The burden is not merely seeing what others cannot. It is carrying insights that no one else is prepared to validate. This is why so many highly perceptive people feel as though they are living slightly outside of time, as if they are witnessing events before they unfold, patterns before they become visible, truths before they become acceptable. Jung observed that this temporal displacement creates what he called psychological loneliness. Not the loneliness of lacking people, but the loneliness of lacking mirrors. Those who see deeply often have no one who can fully see them. But Jung insisted this loneliness is not a sign of error, it is a stage of individuation, a period of internal reorganization where perception begins to find structure, meaning, and ethical direction. He wrote, "The curse of the conscious mind is to perceive what others do not, and to bear it alone until the world has grown enough to meet it. In this stage, the goal is not to retreat, but to develop inner strength strong enough to hold perception without collapsing under it. The highly perceptive individual must learn to build an inner sanctuary strong enough that external misunderstanding no longer destabilizes them." Jung discovered that people with differentiated perception often become targets of shadow projection. Because they see clearly, others feel seen in ways they did not consent to. Their unconscious becomes exposed, and instead of facing their own hidden material, they attack the mirror that revealed it. Jung wrote, "When the shadow is unacknowledged, it demands a scapegoat." Thus, the perceptive individual becomes the identified problem in families, workplaces, and relationships. Not because they create conflict, but because their very presence reveals the conflicts already there. Jung documented patients who were blamed for disrupting the emotional equilibrium of systems that were already dysfunctional. Their accuracy was labeled negativity. Their insight was labeled overthinking. Their intuition was labeled paranoia. This is a predictable psychological defense. When a person cannot face their own darkness, they call the person who sees it dangerous. But Jung emphasized this: the perceptive individual must never become ashamed of seeing clearly. Clarity is not cruelty. Perception is not aggression. Awareness is not judgment. The danger comes only when you believe others' fear of your perception means there is something wrong with you. There isn't, you simply see what they are not ready to face. Jung classified 4 distinct variations of the highly perceptive intuitive type, each with its own strengths and psychological vulnerabilities. Type 1. The feeling. Intuitive. This person absorbs emotional atmospheres like a tuning fork. They sense grief behind a smile, resentment behind politeness, disappointment behind silence. Their body becomes the instrument through which others' unspoken emotions vibrate. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. This person perceives unconscious patterns with surgical clarity. They forecast breakdowns, betrayals, and relationship collapses long before the surface reveals anything wrong. Their accuracy comes not from analysis, but from unconscious data recognition. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. This individual feels psychological tension in physical form, as heaviness, fatigue, pressure, or discomfort. They detect illness before symptoms, emotional suppression before words, and danger before logic can explain it. Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest and most overwhelmed. They perceive everything: emotions, patterns, shadows, contradictions, but cannot yet organize the information. Their gift arrives raw, unfiltered, flooding them with insights they cannot articulate or structure. Jung emphasized that each type requires a different path of integration. but all share the same risk: being drowned by the unconscious material of others before learning to return to themselves. Jung identified 3 existential dangers faced by people who see too much. Danger 1. Disruption of collective illusions. Every family, workplace, and society depends on shared fictions to function, unspoken agreements about what will not be acknowledged. The perceptive individual threatens these agreements simply by existing. Their clarity destabilizes the unconscious bonds that hold groups together. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. When no one can meet you at the depth you perceive, you begin to feel unreal to others, and others unreal to you. This, Jung said, creates islands of consciousness in an ocean of unconscious life. Danger 3. Identity dissolution. The perceptive individual absorbs so much unconscious content that they risk losing themselves entirely. Their inner world blurs with the unprocessed emotions of others. They become a vessel for collective material instead of an individual with boundaries. Jung called this the annihilation of individuality through unconscious possession. This is why integration is not optional. It is psychological survival. The perceptive individual often carries entire emotional systems on their shoulders without realizing none of it is theirs. Jung instructed patients to practice psychic sorting, a deliberate process of identifying which emotions, fears, impulses, and thoughts originate internally and which were taken in from the environment. He wrote, "One must first become conscious of what is not oneself before one can discover what is." Daily solitude was essential. Not isolation, but intentional withdrawal where the external psychic material could settle and the individual could hear their own authentic psychological voice. Jung warned that without this practice, the person with superior perception will drown in other people's unconscious content and mistake it for their own inner world. The first victory is not seeing more. It is learning to see yourself again. Shadow integration is the second phase of transformation. Jung discovered that people who see other people's shadows clearly often struggle most with their own. Their perceptive ability becomes distorted when they refuse to acknowledge within themselves the very qualities they detect in others. He wrote, "The shadow that is unseen in oneself is intolerable when perceived in another." For the highly perceptive individual, this creates a double burden: the weight of others' hidden material and the denial of their own. Jung insisted, "You must integrate your own capacity for selfishness, anger, manipulation, ambition, and cruelty, not to indulge them, but to stop being controlled by their unconscious form. Only then can you see others clearly without becoming disturbed by what you perceive." Shadow integration converts perception from a wound into a wisdom. It transforms empathy from absorption into understanding. And it prevents the perceptive individual from becoming superior, judgmental, or morally inflated, the corruption Jung feared most. The final stage Jung taught is conscious participation in the collective unconscious. This does not mean merging with others' emotions, that is the unintegrated state. It means engaging with unconscious material while maintaining the integrity of your own identity. Jung wrote, "The individuated person becomes a bridge between the unconscious and consciousness. You do not dissolve into the psychic field, you move through it with awareness." This requires developing psychological containers, structures within the self that can temporarily hold others' emotions without absorbing them. A container is clarity of self, firm inner boundaries, and a conscious decision to witness without merging. Jung emphasized that once containment is developed, the perceptive individual becomes a stabilizing force for others rather than an emotional sponge. They can listen deeply without losing themselves. They can guide without carrying. They can perceive without suffering. This is the transformation from overwhelmed intuitive into integrated seer. Because superior perception can rise or collapse a psyche, Jung studied historical figures to understand both outcomes. Nietzsche represented the danger. His perception exceeded his integration. He saw too deeply without the psychological structure to carry what he saw. Jung wrote, he identified with the archetype and was devoured by it. Nietzsche became overwhelmed by the very clarity that made him brilliant. Insight without containment became psychic fragmentation. In contrast, Jung praised Meister Eckhart as a model of successful integration. Eckhart perceived realities far beyond the collective consciousness of his time, but his humility, grounding practices, and ethical discipline kept his perception constructive. Eckhart did not wield insight as a weapon. He transformed it into wisdom. Jung said, he saw deeply but he spoke gently. This contrast revealed the truth. Superior perception is not the danger. Unintegrated perception is. Jung concluded that individuals with differentiated perception play a crucial evolutionary role. He believed they are consciousness pioneers, carriers of insight that the collective will not understand for decades or centuries. These people feel cultural problems first. They sense societal fractures before they erupt. They intuit environmental or psychological crises long before the collective wakes up. Jung wrote, the individual who perceives ahead of the collective suffers the collective's future before the collective does. This is why your life has felt heavier than others. You were carrying material that was never just personal. But Jung insisted, this suffering is not punishment, it is preparation. Your perception is not meant to be endured alone. It is meant to be refined into something that elevates others. You are not ahead by accident. You are ahead because consciousness needs scouts. And scouts always walk the terrain before the army arrives. But Jung also warned that the path of the perceptive individual is filled with psychological traps that can derail the entire transformation. The first danger is inflation. When someone begins to recognize the depth of their perception, the ego may identify with it and believe itself superior. Jung called this possession by the superior function. Instead of seeing clearly, the person becomes blinded by their identification with clarity. They stop listening. They stop learning. They preach instead of perceiving. Jung observed, the moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the deepest unconsciousness. Inflation isolates not because others cannot understand you, but because the inflated individual no longer understands others. True perception requires humility. Without it, insight becomes delusion. Some perceptive individuals, tired of misunderstanding and projection, convince themselves that humanity is beneath them. They escape into spiritual superiority, declaring themselves too conscious to engage with ordinary people. Jung rejected this completely. The hermit who withdraws not from choice but from woundedness has not transcended life but been defeated by it. Withdrawal is sometimes necessary for healing or recalibration. But permanent retreat is the collapse of individuation. The goal is not to escape the world. It is to walk through it without losing yourself. Not isolation, selective engagement. The third danger Jung warned against is the helper's high. This is when perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. Their identity fuses with their ability to understand and heal others. They become the therapist friend, the emotional medic, the spiritual guide, the crisis responder. And beneath the surface is a fear. If I am not useful, I will not be valued. Jung wrote, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. The helper's high feels noble but erodes the self. Your worth is not measured by how much pain you carry for others. Individuation requires reclaiming your life from the roles you were trained to play. Even integrated individuals, Jung noted, can regress into overwhelm during periods of stress, grief, or trauma. When boundaries soften, the old patterns return. Absorbing emotions, mistaking others' pain for your own, and becoming flooded with unconscious material. This is the overwhelm return. Jung emphasized that integration is not a final achievement but a practice, a dance between consciousness and unconsciousness, between solitude and connection, between self and other. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light but by making the darkness conscious." The goal is not perfection, it is awareness. Awareness that allows you to notice when you're slipping and return to yourself without shame. These included regular solitude to release absorbed psychological material and hear your inner voice again. Conscious engagement, choosing when to use perceptive abilities instead of letting them run automatically. Shadow work to prevent projection and maintain humility. Relationships with others capable of reflecting truth without defensiveness. Creative expression as a necessary outlet for overwhelming intuitive data. Jung insisted that without these practices, even the most evolved individual would fall back into participation mystique, the unconscious merging with others that erases the self. Maintenance is not optional. It is the cost of clarity. He saw them as consciousness pioneers, individuals born with psychological capacities that the collective will not develop for generations. They see patterns that societies are still blind to. They feel collective tensions before they erupt into crises. They sense the coming shifts in culture, morality, and meaning. Jung wrote, "The individual is the advance guard of the collective transformation." This means your struggles are not personal failures. They are early encounters with the realities humanity has not yet learned to face. You are living the future in a world still trapped in the past. Throughout history, individuals with superior perception appeared before collective readiness. They were called prophets, mystics, madmen, visionaries, heretics, or threats. Later, society recognized that these individuals had simply seen too early what everyone else would eventually be forced to see. Jung described this pattern. What appears first in the individual emerges later in the collective. This means your sensitivity is not an anomaly. It is a preview. Your perception is not an error. It is an evolutionary edge. The tragedy is that many never learn to integrate it and are crushed by the weight of what they know. Jung believed that the modern world places an even heavier burden on highly perceptive individuals. Because unlike past societies where mystics and seers had roles, today's culture values efficiency, conformity, and emotional numbness. A person who sees deeply is treated as disruptive. A person who feels deeply is labeled too sensitive. A person who questions collective illusions is dismissed as negative. Jung wrote, "The possession of superior perception does not grant privilege, it demands responsibility. The responsibility to understand what you see, to integrate it consciously, and to not collapse under its intensity. You were not meant to fit in, you were meant to illuminate." This is why Jung emphasized the importance of finding the few who understand. Even one relationship with someone capable of engaging your depth without fear can prevent psychological isolation. Jung identified 3 kinds of people who can walk beside the perceptive individual. The individuated who live with clarity and authenticity. The seekers who are actively engaged in self-discovery and inner work. The natural containers whose presence brings stability, even without sharing your abilities. He wrote, "The soul requires witnesses who can bear its truth without trembling." Your perception does not need many allies, it needs the right ones. Jung developed a method for revealing your depth to others without overwhelming them. He called it the gradual revelation protocol. Begin with subtle insights. Observe how they respond, with curiosity or defensiveness. Increase depth slowly as mutual trust grows. Never force perception onto someone who is not ready. Jung warned, "Truth offered to an unprepared soul is experienced as violence." Your perception is medicine, but not everyone can receive it in its full potency. Wise discernment is part of your individuation. Because superior perception can overwhelm even the strongest minds, Jung documented the 4 most dangerous pitfalls that threaten highly perceptive individuals. Pitfall 1. Psychological inflation. This occurs when you begin to identify with your abilities instead of integrating them. You see deeper than others, so you begin to believe you are above others. Jung warned, this is the quickest path to collapse. Pitfall 2. Withdrawal into superiority. Some retreat entirely, claiming others are too unconscious to engage with. This is not wisdom, it is fear disguised as insight. Pitfall 3. The helper's addiction. When you define yourself entirely through helping others, you lose contact with your own development. Perception becomes identity, and the self dissolves behind the role. Pitfall 4. The return of overwhelm. Even those who have integrated their perception can lose stability during emotional stress or trauma. They begin absorbing others' unconscious material again without realizing it. Jung emphasized that integration is not a final achievement. It is a continuous relationship with your inner world. He taught that the perceptive individual must maintain specific practices to remain grounded. Regular solitude, conscious boundary setting, shadow work, connection with stable allies, creative expression. These practices do not make you less sensitive. They make you stronger than your sensitivity. Jung believed that individuals with superior perception serve an essential evolutionary function. You feel collective problems before society is willing to face them. You detect psychological patterns that others still deny. You sense the consequences of cultural decisions long before they manifest. Jung wrote, "The sensitive individual is the early warning system of civilization. Your suffering was never meaningless. It was the pressure of carrying the future unconscious before the world was ready to hold it. You are not fragile. You are ahead of schedule." Jung identified 3 historical patterns in how superior perception enters the world. Pattern 1. The misunderstood pioneer. These individuals are rejected in their lifetime and celebrated only after their insights prove true. Pattern 2. The cultural bridge. These individuals translate deep perception into forms the collective can slowly absorb. Art, philosophy, psychology, spirituality. Pattern 3. The healer of the unseen. These individuals use their perception to help others integrate unconscious material long before the culture understands its value. Jung wrote, "Where the collective refuses to look, the perceptive individual is compelled to gaze. Your gaze is not a burden, it is a torch." But Jung insisted on one truth above all others. Superior perception must become service, not martyrdom, not superiority, not withdrawal, but conscious participation in the world. He called this the path of the individuated one, not the path of the savior, not the path of the victim, but the path of the one who sees clearly and chooses wisely. You do not exist to carry everyone's unconsciousness. You exist to illuminate your own. And through your illumination, others learn to see. At the highest stage, Jung described a rare transformation. The perceptive individual stops fighting their depth, stops apologizing for their insights, stops shrinking to protect others from truths they refuse to face. They reach a state Jung called the transcendent function, where perception becomes effortless, where insight flows without overwhelm, where you see clearly without needing others to understand you. At this level, you do not argue with unconsciousness. You simply remain conscious. And consciousness, as Jung taught, changes everything it touches. Jung emphasized that individuals with superior perception must learn one crucial skill: to hold their insights lightly. Not every truth must be spoken. Not every perception must be shared. Not every shadow you see is yours to illuminate. This is not avoidance, it is maturity. Jung wrote, "Insight without discretion is violence upon the unconscious." The integrated perceiver understands that timing matters, readiness matters, capacity matters. Wisdom is not merely seeing deeply, it is knowing when to reveal what you see. As the perceptive individual matures, their relationship to conflict changes. They no longer try to convince others. They no longer plead to be understood. They no longer argue about what is obvious to their inner vision. Instead, they allow truth to unfold naturally. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Your role is not to drag others into awareness. Your role is to remain aware so others can find you when they are ready. Your clarity becomes a lighthouse, not a spotlight. Jung taught that the final test for the highly perceptive individual is learning to trust themselves completely. Not partially, not conditionally, not only when others agree. Completely. Because your perception has been accurate your entire life. The problem wasn't your seeing, it was your doubt. You doubted your intuition because others needed you blind. You doubted your insights because others feared being seen. You doubted your truth because the collective told you it was too much. Jung wrote, "The eyes of the conscious one are unsettling to the unconscious many." This self-trust marks the beginning of what Jung called conscious sovereignty, a state where your perception is no longer a threat to your stability but the foundation of it, where your empathy is no longer a doorway for overwhelm but a finely tuned instrument of understanding, where your intuition is not a whisper you ignore but a compass you follow. At this level, manipulation fails. Chaos cannot infiltrate. Your boundaries become effortless, not walls, but energetic signatures that say clearly, "I see everything and choose consciously." Jung noted that once this level is reached, the world responds differently to you. Healthy people feel safer. Wounded people feel hopeful. Manipulative people feel exposed. Fragmented people feel unsettled. Not because you are doing anything, but because your presence changes the psychological temperature of every room you enter. You stop absorbing collective unconsciousness and begin radiating conscious awareness. This is what Jung called the emergence of the self, the moment your inner truth becomes stronger than every external expectation. At the end of this journey, Jung offered a profound revelation. Your perception was never the problem. Your lack of integration was. You were drowning in other people's unconsciousness because no one taught you how to swim in your own depths. Now you understand that your sensitivity is not fragility, it is precision. Your intuition is not imagination, it is intelligence. Your perception is not excess, it is evolution. You are not too much. You are exactly what you were designed to be, a consciousness pioneer ahead of your time. Embodiment is the highest form of wisdom. It means becoming the integration you once sought in others. It means living with such psychological clarity that your boundaries are felt, not announced. It means holding your truth quietly, firmly, without the old trembling that came from self-doubt. Jung wrote, "The self is not spoken, it is lived." Your presence alone begins reorganizing the unconscious dynamics of any space you enter. People become more honest around you, not because you demand honesty, but because dishonesty feels heavier in your presence. People become more reflective around you, not because you lecture them, but because their own shadow becomes harder to ignore. People become more authentic around you, not because you push them, but because your authenticity gives them permission to stop performing. This is the quiet influence of the individuated mind. Jung emphasized that this stage is where your true power emerges. Not the power to control others. That is the desire of the unconscious. But the power to awaken others simply by remaining awake yourself. You become what Jung called an axis of meaning, a stable psychological center around which others can reorganize their fragmented selves. This is why many are drawn to you while others avoid you. Some seek the clarity you radiate, others fear the truth it reveals. Your perception becomes a quiet catalyst for transformation. You must continue the practices that protect your boundaries. Solitude, shadow work, discrimination of emotional ownership, conscious withdrawal when necessary. You are no longer naive to the weight of what you carry. Your perception is precise, your empathy calibrated, your intuition sharpened. But integration is not a destination, it is a discipline. Jung wrote, "What we gain in consciousness must be sustained by it." You stop longing for people to understand you. You stop explaining your depth to those committed to the shallow. You stop shrinking your perception to protect others' comfort. Instead, you surround yourself with those who can meet you as an equal in consciousness. People who value depth over distraction. People who choose growth over comfort. People who do not fear being seen, because they too are learning to see. Jung called these people the companions of the path. At this stage, your life rearranges itself. Relationships shift. Boundaries sharpen. Priorities clarify. Your environment becomes more intentional. Your inner world becomes more spacious. You begin to feel something you have rarely felt in your life. Peace. Not the peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the peace that comes from alignment. Your perception, your empathy, your intuition, your identity, no longer fighting each other, no longer contradicting each other, but moving as one integrated whole. This is the peace Jung meant when he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." As this inner alignment deepens, something extraordinary happens. Your past no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a curriculum. Every betrayal becomes instruction. Every disappointment becomes initiation. Every moment you were misunderstood becomes evidence of how far your perception extended beyond the collective. Jung wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You realize the darkness you faced was not punishment, it was preparation. Preparation for vision, preparation for discernment, preparation for sovereignty. With this realization, your relationship to others changes. You no longer need to fix them. You no longer need to rescue them. You no longer need to carry emotions they refuse to carry themselves. Instead, you observe without absorbing. You help without losing yourself. You listen without being pulled into someone else's psychological storm. This is conscious empathy. The form Jung believed was the highest expression of the feeling function. Not enmeshment, not martyrdom, but ethical compassion anchored in truth. People begin responding to you differently. Some feel seen in a way they have never experienced. Not admired, not idealized, seen. And for the first time, they feel safe being transparent rather than defensive. They feel safe being flawed rather than performatively perfect. Around you, truth becomes breathable. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Your presence becomes transformative, not by force but by resonance. But others respond with discomfort. Your clarity threatens their denial. Your boundaries challenge their entitlement. Your authenticity exposes their performance. These people will either evolve or quietly exit your life. Both outcomes serve your individuation. Jung warned that the unconscious resists with all its might when consciousness attempts to expand. Your growth will disturb those who depend on your old limitations. Let them be disturbed. Your evolution is not an apology. Self-trust. Not confidence based on achievement, but trust based on inner alignment. You trust your perception. You trust your intuition. You trust your emotional clarity. You trust your boundaries. You trust the quiet voice inside you that was ridiculed, dismissed, belittled, or feared by others who could not tolerate its accuracy. Jung wrote, "Only the individual who knows his own darkness can deal with the darkness of others." You have walked through your darkness. Now you walk with a steadiness that cannot be taught, only earned. They recognize in you a psychological maturity that is rare in the collective. They feel your groundedness, they feel your discernment, they feel your emotional stability. You become a lighthouse, not because you demand attention, but because you stand firmly in your own illumination. Those navigating their storms find guidance in your presence. Those committed to their shadows avoid you entirely. Both responses confirm your alignment. As individuation deepens, the perceptive individual enters a phase Jung called the stabilizing descent. It is the moment when clarity stops feeling like a sudden illumination and begins to feel like a foundation, something lived rather than discovered. You no longer rush to interpret everything you perceive. You allow the unconscious contents of others to reveal themselves naturally. Perception becomes patience. Insight becomes observation. Awareness becomes rhythm. This is the phase where the mind stops burning and begins integrating. Jung wrote, "The signs are always there, but only when the soul is quiet do they become readable." Your soul has become quiet, not weak, not numb, but still. And in that stillness, your perception becomes sharper than ever, because it is no longer distorted by urgency or fear. One of the most startling changes in this phase is the disappearance of the need to explain yourself. You stop over-justifying your boundaries. You stop narrating your intentions to avoid misunderstandings. You stop shrinking your truth to accommodate the comfort of others. Now you simply act, and those who resonate will understand without explanation. Those who don't will interpret your actions through their own shadows, and that too becomes useful data. No longer needing to control how you are perceived is one of the highest forms of psychological freedom. Your emotional life transforms as well. Instead of being overwhelmed by others' unconscious material, you begin to sense the exact moment a feeling enters your field, and whether it belongs to you. This is the birth of emotional sovereignty. Your inner world becomes organized. You develop the ability to track subtle shifts in your body, your intuition, your mood, your impulses, and you know precisely when something foreign tries to merge with your psyche. Where you once absorbed everything automatically, you now choose what you engage with. Choice is the hallmark of sovereignty. Relationships undergo a profound reorganization in this stage. People who once fascinated you now feel hollow. People who once intimidated you now feel predictable. People who once confused you now feel transparent. You begin to sense the psychological architecture of everyone you meet. Their defenses, their unresolved wounds, their hidden motives, their suppressed desires, their projected fears. But instead of being overwhelmed by this awareness, you hold it with neutrality. You no longer internalize what you perceive, you simply see it. And those who cannot tolerate being seen begin to withdraw on their own. Your presence becomes a natural boundary. The most surprising development is this. You start valuing simplicity. Not because your perception has dimmed, but because it has matured. You stop seeking chaotic people to rescue. You stop tolerating emotional volatility disguised as passion. You stop engaging in dynamics that drain your stability. What once felt exciting now feels noisy. What once felt familiar now feels misaligned. What once felt like obligation now feels optional. The individuated perceptive mind desires peace, because it finally understands how rare, how precious, and how non-negotiable peace truly is. This phase culminates in what Jung described as the psychic center of gravity shifting inward. Your life no longer orbits around others' reactions. Your value no longer depends on usefulness. Your identity no longer depends on mirroring. You become internally referenced rather than externally controlled. And in this shift, something profound emerges. Your presence stops reflecting the unconscious of others and begins reflecting your own sovereignty. This is when your perception stops being a burden and becomes a force. Not a force that dominates, but a force that stabilizes. a consciousness anchored deeply enough to illuminate without absorbing, to witness without drowning, to feel without fragmenting. This is the beginning of psychological adulthood for the highly perceptive individual, and it marks the doorway into an entirely new stage of individuation. As the perceptive individual continues through the deeper corridors of individuation, a new internal architecture begins to take shape, one that Jung described as the emergence of the inner authority. This shift is subtle at first. You notice it when you decline something without guilt. You feel it when you say no without rehearsing reasons. You sense it when you walk away from dynamics that once held you hostage. Inner authority is the point at which your perception no longer seeks validation. It becomes self-sustaining. Jung wrote that the individuated person knows the truth by its resonance rather than by its approval. You begin to feel this resonance viscerally. Your body reacts before your mind forms language. Your intuition answers before your intellect constructs arguments. This is not impulsivity, this is alignment. With this alignment comes a new relationship to conflict. You stop fearing conflict as a threat and begin seeing it as information. When someone reacts with disproportionate anger, you no longer internalize their reaction as proof of your wrongdoing. You recognize it as a rupture in their own shadow. When someone accuses you of selfishness for setting boundaries, you no longer collapse into apology. You see it as evidence of their dependence on your lack of boundaries. When someone withdraws because you refuse to tolerate their manipulation, you no longer chase after them. You see the withdrawal as a cleansing. What once destabilized you now clarifies you. Another remarkable transformation in this stage is the maturation of your perceptive gaze. Before integration, your perception was wide, absorbing everything, flooding your system with more information than it could hold. Now your perception becomes precise. You start noticing the difference between what matters and what is noise, what is projected and what is authentic, what needs engagement and what needs distance. Jung called this the narrowing of the beam. Your intuitive spotlight stops scanning the entire landscape and begins illuminating only what serves your growth. For the first time in your life, your own psyche becomes your primary subject of attention. You stop rescuing others. You stop diagnosing others. You stop interpreting others as a way to avoid yourself. This is the turning inward that Jung considered essential for wholeness. But this inward turn does not lead to isolation. It leads to discernment. You begin to notice which relationships expand you and which ones compress you. You notice who listens to understand and who listens to respond. You notice who feels safe and who feels familiar but not safe. The distinction becomes undeniable. People who once occupied the center of your life begin moving to the edges, not because of anger but because of clarity. Clarity rearranges everything. This phase also brings a profound shift in how you handle emotional energy. Instead of absorbing others' feelings, you learn to mirror them back without fusion. Someone expresses anger, and instead of absorbing it, you observe its shape and return it to sender. Someone expresses sadness, and instead of drowning in it, you hold space without losing center. Someone expresses insecurity, and instead of compensating for it, you maintain your ground. Your emotional system becomes impermeable in the healthiest sense. Porous enough to feel, solid enough not to collapse. This is what Jung meant by psychological containment. Then comes the most powerful development in this stage. Your intuition becomes directional. Where earlier in life it was reactive, warning you, alerting you, protecting you, now it becomes generative. It begins showing you where to go, what to build, what to release, what to cultivate. Instead of merely protecting you from danger, it begins guiding you toward destiny. Jung believed that once perception stabilizes, it becomes a compass for individuation itself. You begin dreaming differently. You begin feeling urges toward new landscapes, new studies, new creative expressions, new forms of service. Your psyche expands beyond survival and begins moving toward purpose. The culmination of this block arrives in the moment Jung described as the psychological click. It is the instant you realize that life no longer happens to you and begins happening through you. Your choices feel aligned. Your perception feels trustworthy. Your boundaries feel natural. Your silence feels powerful. Your presence feels intentional. You are no longer shaping yourself to fit the world. You are shaping the world by refusing to distort yourself. This is the foundation of sovereignty. And it marks the entry into the next phase of the journey, a phase where perception evolves into mastery. This is the moment when the unconscious stops feeling like an adversary and begins functioning as an ally. You notice it first in your intuition. What once appeared as sudden flashes of insight now arrives as a continuous stream of subtle, guiding impressions. Your psyche no longer whispers warnings alone. It begins offering direction. This is not fantasy. This is the psyche reorganizing itself around truth. Jung wrote, "When the unconscious becomes a partner rather than a predator, the individual approaches wholeness. Your unconscious is no longer working against you, flooding you with signals you cannot interpret, burdening you with emotions that are not yours, exposing you to patterns you cannot hold. It begins working with you." This is the transition from survival consciousness to sovereign consciousness. During this stage, your relationship to time changes. You stop replaying old conversations to self-correct them. You stop forecasting other people's reactions before making a decision. You stop analyzing every moment for threat or instability. Presence becomes natural. Presence becomes easy. Presence becomes your default orientation. What once felt like constant vigilance now dissolves into grounded awareness. Your nervous system, after years of hyper-attunement, finally begins to unwind. This creates what Jung described as psychic spaciousness, a psychological environment within yourself where intuition, reflection, creativity, and clarity can arise without obstruction. You no longer live in anticipation or aftermath. You live in the moment you are actually in. This is the first true taste of internal freedom. With this freedom comes another transformation. Your boundaries become effortless. Not rigid, not aggressive, effortless. You no longer explain them. You no longer negotiate them. You no longer apologize for them. Boundaries stop being something you enforce and become something you are. People feel them before you ever speak them. Your presence communicates. This is my field, this is my time, this is my truth. Enter respectfully or not at all. This boundary is not a wall, it is an atmosphere. Those who resonate with your authenticity feel welcomed. Those who depend on your self-betrayal feel repelled. And for the first time, you do not bend to accommodate either response. This stage also reveals something extraordinary. Your sensitivity becomes calibrated. Where before you sensed everything, every emotional ripple, every energetic shift, every unspoken thought, now your system filters naturally. You begin sensing only what is relevant to your well-being, your evolution, or your relationships. Your perception becomes selective without losing accuracy. Jung compared this to the sharpening of a blade. When consciousness differentiates properly, perception becomes precise rather than overwhelming. You feel less but understand more. You absorb less but discern more. You react less but perceive more. This marks the end of empathic exhaustion and the beginning of empathic mastery. Another profound shift emerges at this stage: the collapse of performance. You stop performing emotional labor for others. You stop performing stability to keep others calm. You stop performing kindness to avoid conflict. You stop performing smallness to avoid envy. Your authenticity becomes non-negotiable. This authenticity is not loud. It is not rebellious. It is not dramatic. It is simply undeniable. You walk differently. You speak differently, you choose differently, you relate differently. You no longer shape yourself to fit dynamics. Dynamics reshape themselves in your presence. This is when people begin saying things like, "You feel different. You seem stronger. You're not as easily swayed. I can't read you anymore." What they are actually witnessing is the emergence of your psychological center. Then comes the most crucial turning. Your projection field collapses. All the stories you inherited about who you are, what you deserve, what you must tolerate, what you must fix, what you must carry, begin dissolving. The internalized voices that once governed your identity start to fall away one by one. The parent who taught you self-sacrifice as virtue. The friend who taught you to equate sensitivity with weakness. The partners who taught you to doubt your intuition. The environment that taught you to overfunction. One by one, their voices fade. And what remains is your actual voice, and quiet, centered, and unmistakably your own. This is the emergence of psychological sovereignty. At this point, a new pattern becomes visible. You begin attracting individuals who match your depth. They appear suddenly and unmistakably. People with capacity, people with emotional maturity, people who do not fear being seen, people who do not flee from truth, people whose presence feels like oxygen rather than obligation. These are what Jung called reciprocal souls, individuals whose inner world resonates with yours at a level beyond personality or preference. You do not need to hide your perception from them. You do not need to shrink your intuition. You do not need to censor your insight. You do not need to manage their insecurity. You can be fully present because they are fully present. And for the first time, connection feels effortless rather than earned. This is the relational awakening of the individuated mind. You have crossed a threshold. Your life is no longer governed by reactivity. It is governed by intentionality. Your perception is no longer a burden, it is a compass. Your sensitivity is no longer a weakness, it is refinement. Your boundaries are no longer protection, they are identity. Your solitude is no longer loneliness, it is alignment. This is the beginning of a new psychological reality, one that leads into the next phase of the journey, where perception becomes purpose and consciousness becomes contribution. As your psychological center strengthens, a new landscape begins to open within you, what Jung called the deep interior. This is not the unconscious as a threat, but the unconscious as terrain, a place you can walk through consciously without fear of getting lost or swallowed by the emotions of others. You begin to notice something extraordinary. Your mind no longer fragments under pressure. Instead, it becomes more coherent, more spacious, more deliberate. The inner chaos that once felt like a storm begins organizing itself into patterns, symbols, and insights. This is the moment Jung described as the psyche teaching the ego. Your inner world stops feeling like a battlefield and starts feeling like a library. Every emotion a book, every intuition a doorway, every insight a map. You can navigate your depth without drowning in it. During this stage, the emotional residues of others stop clinging to you. You no longer feel responsible for stabilizing the people around you. You no longer absorb the moods that do not belong to you. You no longer merge with the emotional storms of anyone who enters your space. Instead, you witness them with clarity without collapsing into them. You've developed psychological boundaries at the level of perception. This is not dissociation, this is mastery. Jung described it as the birth of inner distinction. For the first time in your life, you can say with certainty, "This feeling is mine, that feeling is not." And with that distinction, your nervous system begins to heal from decades of emotional over-identification. Then something profound occurs. Your intuition becomes prophetic. Not mystical, not magical, but precise. You begin seeing the psychological consequences of people's actions long before they unfold. You can feel the trajectory of relationships. You can sense the collapse of illusions. You can predict emotional patterns with calm certainty. This is because your intuition is no longer polluted by self-doubt. Your inner knowing operates at full capacity. Jung observed that individuals in this stage perceive the motion of the psyche before it becomes visible. You stop being surprised by people. Nothing feels random, nothing feels confusing, nothing feels chaotic. Patterns that once tormented you now appear obvious. This is the intelligence you were always meant to access. This is also when your presence begins shifting rooms. You don't say more, you say less, but everything you say lands with weight. People sense something in you that they cannot name, a combination of groundedness and clarity that forces them to confront themselves. The insecure become reactive. The manipulative become uncomfortable. The authentic become calm. The wise become curious. Your presence begins sorting people without any effort on your part. This is what Jung called the autonomous ordering function of the self. You don't chase, you don't retreat, you simply stand. And your standing reveals the truth of everyone around you. You also begin experiencing moments of what Jung described as synchronous alignment. Coincidences increase. Symbolic patterns appear in your life. Internal insights match external events. Paths open just as you are ready to walk them. Jung believed this was the psyche moving in cooperation with reality, rather than in conflict with it. You are no longer forcing your life, you are following it. You are no longer searching for signs, you are recognizing them. Your perception becomes a dialogue between the inner world and the outer one, each mirroring the other with uncanny accuracy. This is the beginning of inner-outer coherence. And then comes one of the most mysterious transitions. You stop feeling fear in the places where fear once ruled. You stop fearing abandonment because you cannot abandon yourself. You stop fearing rejection because it no longer defines you. You stop fearing conflict because your boundaries speak for you. You stop fearing loss because you no longer cling to what harms you. Fear doesn't disappear, it becomes small. It becomes informative rather than controlling. Jung described this as the ego returning to its rightful scale. For the first time, you are no longer ruled by ancient emotional survival responses. You walk through the world with a steadiness that cannot be shaken externally because it is stabilized internally. Your nervous system begins operating at the frequency of truth rather than the frequency of fear. From this internal structure comes a new external capacity. You begin making decisions cleanly. Not based on guilt, not based on obligation, not based on fear of disappointing others, not based on the need for validation. Decisions arise from clarity rather than emotional entanglement. You choose based on alignment, not appeasement. You choose based on truth, not trauma. You choose based on sovereignty, not self-sacrifice. And for the first time, your life begins to move in the direction of your actual self rather than the selves others projected onto you. The world can finally meet the person you were always meant to be. As your consciousness advances, your relationship with conflict transforms completely. You no longer avoid it. You no longer fear it. You no longer personalize it. Instead, you recognize conflict as information, the revelation of misalignment. When someone becomes angry because of your boundary, you understand that their anger is evidence of the boundary's necessity. When someone withdraws because you no longer overfunction, you understand that you were carrying their responsibilities as well as your own. When someone accuses you of changing because you stopped collapsing into their needs, you understand that you have finally returned to yourself. Conflict stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like data. This is the evolution from emotional reactivity to psychological literacy. You will also notice that your silence becomes more powerful than your words. Silence used to feel like weakness and inability to defend yourself. But now your silence is a decision, not a collapse. It communicates. I do not abandon myself to win your approval. I will not explain truth to someone committed to misunderstanding it. I do not negotiate with dysfunction. This silence is not passive, it is sovereign. It is the silence of someone who has nothing left to prove and nothing left to justify. Jung described this as the withdrawal of psychic participation. You stop feeding dynamics that drain your energy. And without your participation, those dynamics collapse. Soon your emotional body begins doing something extraordinary. It stops absorbing what does not belong to it. Where once you took responsibility for everyone's moods, fears, insecurities, and projections, now your system rejects them automatically. Your body will physically recoil from inauthenticity. Your intuition will intensify around manipulation. Your clarity will sharpen around truth. This is not sensitivity, this is calibration. Your nervous system has learned the difference between resonance and intrusion. Jung referred to this phenomenon as the somatic awakening of the self. Your body begins speaking with the accuracy your intellect never could. Another transformation unfolds quietly. Your past stops governing your present. The emotional loops you once repeated without understanding why begin dissolving. People who once triggered you no longer penetrate your field. Dynamics that once hooked you now feel transparent and predictable. Old wounds that once defined you now feel like stories you have outgrown. You realize the past has no power except the power you give it. This is the liberation that comes from seeing clearly. Jung wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You have made yours conscious. And consciousness undoes what trauma created. Relationships transform dramatically in this phase. You stop being drawn to intensity disguised as connection. You stop mistaking chaos for chemistry. You stop confusing emotional labor with love. You stop forming bonds with people who cannot meet you. Instead, you become attracted to calmness, consistency, reciprocity, self-awareness, and depth. You no longer chase potential. You respond to reality. You no longer stay because of hope. You stay because of alignment. This marks the end of trauma-based relating and the beginning of conscious relating. Your heart becomes wiser than your wounds. But perhaps the most profound shift of all is what happens to your identity. You stop identifying as the healer, the fixer, the savior, the caretaker, the one who holds everyone together. These roles fall away because they were never your identity. They were your adaptations. And when the adaptation dissolves, your authentic self emerges. You begin creating from inspiration rather than obligation. You begin choosing from awareness rather than fear. You begin relating from clarity rather than survival. You step into the life you would have lived had you never been wounded. This is the psychological rebirth Jung referred to as individuation, the emergence of the self from beneath the rubble of conditioning. It is the moment you finally recognize your own depth, not as a liability but as destiny. All the parts of you that once fought each other, the sensitive one, the analytical one, the intuitive one, the wounded one, the angry one, the hopeful one, stop operating as enemies and begin functioning as collaborators. Your psyche stops fragmenting under stress. Your emotions stop contradicting your logic. Your intuition stops clashing with your reasoning. Every part of you moves in the same direction. This internal unity is the foundation of psychological power. From this unity arises something rare, a stable sense of self. You no longer change based on who you are around. You no longer shrink to match the insecurities of others. You no longer expand to compensate for their lack of awareness. You remain yourself in all environments. This is the birth of inner constancy. Because of this constancy, your emotional responses begin to mature into emotional intentions. You no longer react impulsively, speak prematurely, or attach unconsciously. You feel everything, but nothing controls you. Your emotions become guides rather than rulers. Anger becomes clarity. Sadness becomes depth. Fear becomes information. Joy becomes direction. Intuition becomes strategy. This is emotional alchemy, the transformation of raw feeling into refined awareness. Another phenomenon appears here. Your life becomes quieter. Not empty, quiet. Drama exits your field. Chaos stops finding you. Crisis stops orbiting your life. Toxic people simply fade away. This is not coincidence, this is resonance. When your inner world stabilizes, your outer world reorganizes to match it. Jung said, "The outer world is a reflection of the inner condition." Your new inner condition is peace. Your external reality mirrors it. But the world will test you, not to break you, but to confirm your transformation. People from your past may return with familiar patterns. Your old wounds may resurface briefly. Old insecurities may whisper again. This is not regression, this is verification. The psyche presents old material to evaluate your new structure. And when you respond from truth instead of trauma, the material dissolves permanently. This is the clearing phase, the removal of everything you no longer resonate with. At the peak of integration, your perception undergoes one final shift. You stop seeing people as their behavior and begin seeing them as their level of consciousness. You recognize some people operate from fear, others from ego, others from wounds, others from awakening, others from integration. This doesn't make you superior. It makes you compassionate without becoming entangled. You understand why people act as they do, but you no longer carry the emotional consequences of their choices. This is the freedom that comes from clarity. And finally, you arrive at what Jung called the autonomous self, a human being who is not ruled by the past, by conditioning, by fear, by perception of others, or by unconscious patterns. Someone who walks through the world awake. Someone who sees without collapsing, feels without absorbing, loves without losing themselves, speaks without performing, thinks without doubting, acts without betraying themselves. Someone who has become their own psychological home. Someone who can finally use their extraordinary perception with wisdom, with precision, and with purpose. The one thing Jung believed the world needed most. A consciousness pioneer. And that is exactly what you have become.